Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to do the second installment of my series that I started yesterday, where I cover a WrestleMania each each day and the countdown to WrestleMania 41. Yeah, and this is WrestleMania 2. Now, as we spoke about yesterday, WrestleMania 2 is very unique in that it originates from three different locations, and it took place on April the 7th, 1986. And it took place on a Monday, which is very unique because other WrestleManias always took place on Sundays. Nowadays, since WrestleMania 36, they've been doing the two-night events, night one and night two, where it takes place on a Saturday and a Sunday, but never on a Monday. This is a very unique occurrence for WrestleMania 2. Anyway, a little bit of background. WrestleMania 1, needless to say, was a success. Vince McMahon made a lot of money with it, made back the $1 million that he got from Jim Crockett. But Jim Crockett also had Starrcade 1984 from two different locations, Greensboro, North Carolina, as well as Atlanta, Georgia. And Vince McMahon, not to be outdone, the mid 80s from Black Saturday in 1984 to 1986, 87, and 88 were the prime years for the mid 80s war between Jim Crockett Promotions and Vince McMahon. But as we're talking about this right now, Jim Crockett is actually doing better. His product is actually better than that of Vince McMahon. So he does that in '85. He main events. He headlined Starrcade with Dusty Rhodes versus Ric Flair, and you have Joe Frazier as the referee. So McMahon had Ali. Uh, Crockett gets Frazier. So then McMahon in '86, the following year, wants to get Frazier too, and he does get Frazier for this event. So just like Crockett did two locations, Vince decides to do three locations. And what are the matches and angles going into this? And how do they launch from WrestleMania 1? Well, WrestleMania 1 ended with a victory of Hulk Hogan teaming with Mr. T to take on Roddy Piper and Paul Orndorff, with Ace Cowboy Bob Orton in the corner of Piper and Orndorff, and Jimmy Superfly Snuka in the corner of Hogan and Mr. T. So the Orton and Piper team blame Orndorff for the loss because it was Orndorff who took the pin. So they kick out Orndorff, and Orndorff turns babyface, and he forms a temporary alliance, spoiler alert, with Hulk Hogan. He and Hulk Hogan form a tag team. He's now a babyface, and he feuds with his former teammates of Bob Orton and Roddy Piper. But Mr. T is not done in professional wrestling. Um, he he continues his feud with Roddy Piper, and at one point, he trains to become a boxer, and he's training with Joe Frazier. This is what I said. They bring in Joe Frazier. He's training with Joe Frazier, and Roddy Piper is also training. They're training in boxing because Orton won a boxing match on one of the Saturday night's main events, and even though he won the match, he attacked Mr. T from behind. So Mr. T challenges Roddy Piper to a boxing match, and that's the main event for the New York card. For the Chicago card, in 1985, the Super Bowl that year, that was Super Bowl 20, and it was the Chicago Bears versus the New England Patriots. And the Chicago Bears won the Super Bowl. So Vince McMahon, since they're holding one third of the event in Chicago, he decides to invite several NFL football players to participate in a battle royal against the WWF superstars. He has William Refrigerator Perry there, Bill Fralick, a bunch of uh, football players. A lot of the NFL, surprisingly enough, the NFL allowed a lot of their players to participate in this event. But William Refrigerator Perry is the one that the media really focuses on for this. He's like the new Mr. T because he's the celebrity that they're propping up because Mr. T is no longer as big as he was in 85 and 86 because he kind of stuck around and he became part of the show. It's kind of like the Ronda Rousey effect. Ronda Rousey was huge when she appeared in WWE in 2015. She was huge even when she appeared in WWE in 2018. But when she started to wrestle, when she started to become a regular part of the roster in 2018 through the beginning of 2019, it was like she was no longer special. So that kind of happened with Mr. T. He was participating in a lot of the angles that they were doing with Piper and Orton because Piper and him had backstage heat. We talked about it yesterday, how Piper felt like because he was an actor and a non-athletic celebrity, he had no place in wrestling. So WWE decided to capitalize on that and create programs around those two, which is kind of stupid because T's luster wore off with that. So they needed a new celebrity. So William Refrigerator Perry was the celebrity that they really built this one around, the Chicago show. And then for the LA portion of it, um, the match they come up with, the main event match they come up with is Hulk Hogan versus King Kong Bundy. We talked about how Hulk Hogan, um, how King Kong Bundy uh, beat SD Jones in 9 seconds at WrestleMania 1. So Bundy has a reputation. Eventually, he switches sides from being managed by Jimmy Hart to being managed by Bobby Heenan. And he and Big John Studd, Big John Studd still continuing his rivalry with Andre the Giant. They team up and they become a tag team. And eventually, they have a tag team match against Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan teaming with Andre the Giant against Big John Studd and King Kong Bundy. And that's when King Kong Bundy begins his feud with Hulk Hogan. So on one of the Saturday night's main events, Hulk Hogan is having a title defense against Don Morocco. And after the match against Don Morocco, Hogan wins and Bundy attacks him with multiple avalanches, fracturing Hogan's ribs. So Hogan is coming to the event with tape ribs. Bundy says, I'm going to put an end to Hulkamania, and it's going to be about Bundy Mania. Bundy Mania. And this is the LA event. The LA match. Also on the New York card is Paul Orndorff versus the Magnificent Morocco with Mr. Fuji. And a second angle I want to talk about, Randy Macho Man Savage. He's just come into the company recently in 85. He came from the Memphis territory. And one thing that was unique about Randy Savage when he first came into the company, the second pay-per-view that WWE ever did, the Wrestling Classic, was a tournament that ended with JYD versus Macho Man Randy Savage. But what they did with him that was unique was that all the managers in WWE, Classy Freddie Blassie, Mr. Fuji, Um, I think Oliver Humperdinck was there. I'm not sure. Basically all the managers were competing for his services, trying to get him. He was the newest free agent when he first came in. But he introduces somebody that nobody's ever heard of. That's not on the roster of managers. That's not Jimmy Hart. That's not Classy Freddie Blassie. That's not Johnny Valiant. That's not Bobby the Brain Heenan. He introduces the lovely Miss Elizabeth, who we didn't know at the time, but was his real life wife. He met her in, she's a Kentucky girl. She majored in communications, and she eventually got a job with Savage's father's promotion. Uh, the IWC, ICW, sorry, ICW, based out of Kentucky. Angelo Poffo, who's Randy Savage's and Lanny Poffo's father, was an outlaw promoter. In other words, what outlaw promoters were like promoters that promoted in a territory against a territory that was specifically sanctioned by the National Wrestling Alliance. So, for example, in the Kentucky area, Frankfort, Kentucky, and pretty much the whole state of Kentucky, um, the territory there was Jerry Jarrett's territory, the Memphis territory. They covered Kentucky, they covered Arkansas, they, they covered Evansville, Indiana, parts of Indiana, and that was their territory. But outlaw promoters such as Angelo Poffo would promote against him. You know, he would hire wrestlers that they didn't want to hire, that the main promotion in that territory didn't feel was skill enough, and he would hire them to work it. And I think Angelo did this because he wanted to feature his sons, Laney and Randy. So what eventually happens is the promotion runs out of money, and they develop an invasion type angle where Macho Man is going on TV telling people that Jerry Lawler, who's the booker slash co-promoter of the Memphis territory, that his wrestling is fake, and his wrestling is phony, and if it came down to a real fight, he could beat um, Jerry Lawler and any of Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett's wrestlers. So they do this kind of invasion angle. And what it really is that Jerry Jarrett is buying out uh, Angelo and the Poffo territory, Angelo Poffo's territory. And Randy Savage eventually goes to work there. Has a really good feud with the Rock and Roll Express at first, too. But in '85, he comes to the WWF. And Miss Elizabeth was an announcer in his father's promotion, and that's when they hooked up. So he brings her into the company as his manager, and this will factor into the storyline because George the Animal Steel develops a crush on her. Basically, he becomes infatuated with her. It's a Beauty and the Beast type storyline because Macho Man is a heel, and what the dynamic that Macho Man Elizabeth began to develop is where the people loved Elizabeth, but they hated the Macho Man. So he would do dastardly things to her. He would pick on her. He would yell at her. He would scream at her. Things that he would do. It was life imitating art because apparently, according to all reports of people that were in the promotion with them, he would actually do shit like that in real life to her. But he would do it on screen to her, be a real mean bully to her. And people were like, well, why does she take this? So seeing this, George the Animal Steel develops a crush on her. He starts to give her flowers. He starts to want to hug her. It's a Beauty and the Beast storyline. But also it's for the Intercontinental Championship. Because remember, we talked about how Greg the Hammer Valentine was the Intercontinental Champion at WrestleMania 1. Well, Greg the Hammer Valentine lost the championship to back to Tito Santana, and Tito Santana lost it to the Macho Man. So the Macho Man had a really good year in '85, coming into the promotion, going to the finals of the Wrestling Classic tournament, and then finally becoming the Intercontinental Champion. So that is another event against George the Animal Steel. George the Animal Steel is a very interesting character because he had an interesting 1985 as well. A little background on him: he is Jim Myers. He was a high school teacher in the mid '60s in Detroit, Michigan, and apparently uh, his job didn't pay enough. So to supplement his income, he became a wrestler, and he was known as the Student. And he was managed by Playboy Gary Hart. This was in the Iron Sheik's territory. I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, well, the excuse me, not the Iron Sheik. Pardon me, not the Iron Sheik, the original Sheik, Ed Farhat. In 1965, Ed Farhat took over the Detroit territory. He was one of the most vicious heels in that territory when Adam Weissmiller, the previous owner, was the owner. And finally, much like other wrestlers, he decided to buy into the territory. So he was used to hiring these oddity wrestlers, and that's basically what the Student was. And Gary Hart was also there as a manager because Gary Hart is from Chicago. So Detroit is not that far from Chicago, both in the Midwest region. And that was the second territory that Gary Hart was in, and he managed the Student, Georgia Animal Steel. Now, in in 1967, Bruno Sammartino, well, he was on a tour of Detroit because he would sometimes go to the Sheik's territory because he and the Sheik in the mid '60s they worked a really really lucrative program against each other in New York. So to do him favors, Sammartino during the time he was WWF champion would sometimes work uh, uh, Cobo Hall in Detroit. So while working there, he discovers George the Animal Steel, and they begin a friendship slash rivalry. And um, he puts the word in his part of the New York territory because they wanted Bruno to buy into the promotion completely. He doesn't do that. He does buy a piece of the promotion. He buys the Pittsburgh territory. So he hires George the Animal Steel to work in the Pittsburgh area. And this he says, but you got to drop the name. Uh, you got to drop the name, the Student. So he develops George Steele because Steele coming out of Steel City, aka Pittsburgh, and it fits. And he's a vicious heel. He's going after Bruno, and finally, Ray Morgan, the announcer for the WWF, discovers him and gives word to Vince McMahon that he wants to work down there. And that's when, in 1967, is when Jim Myers, aka George the Animal Steel, comes to work in the WWF. And throughout all the 60s and early 70s, all throughout the 60s and the 70s, Steel is a vicious heel. He's deranged, he's sick, he's an outlaw. He chews on these chiclets to make his tongue green. He comes out chewing the turnbuckle, and nobody would have any idea that he was a high school teacher, or that he was eloquent, because he would do his interviews and he would go do da do, he would act really crazy. But in 1985, on Saturday Night's Main Event 1, uh, he is in a six-man tag match. He's teaming with the Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov against Ricky Steamboat and the U.S. Express. And Volkov and the Sheik leave him, the Iron Sheik, not Ed Farhat, Khosrow Vaziri. There's the Iron Sheik and there's the original Sheik. The original Sheik is, of course, Ed Farhat, the promoter. He is of Lebanese descent. And the Iron Sheik is Khosrow Vaziri of Iranian descent. But anyway, Khosrow Vaziri, the Iron Sheik, is in the match. And he and Koloff leave. And they let Steele get beat up. So Steele turns face. And then Captain Lou Albano, who, as you guys recall, is the manager of Wyndham and Rotunda, he takes Steele under his wing and he begins to try to civilize Steele. There's skits on Tuesday Night Titans of him, working with Steele, a speech therapist and everything. And Steele becomes now beloved as a babyface in the 80s. And this is really one of his first feuds working with the Macho Man Randy Savage in this Beauty and the Beast type storyline. Jake Roberts is also here. Jake Roberts is, and he's wrestling George Wells. Jake Roberts is coming from the Mid South territory. He, of course, he didn't get along with Bill Watts. He had he had a program against this guy called the Snowman in Watts' territory in '85, and it didn't go over well. He didn't get paid what he felt he should. He never really got along with Watts. Even today, he says that when Watts dies, he'll piss on his grave, which is ironic because Jake's father, Grizzly Smith, which he didn't get along with either, was the right-hand man, aka the Stooge, to Bill Watts in Mid-South. So, and he wrestled in Georgia for a while. He was down there. He teamed with King Kong Bundy and the Road Warriors, and they were the original faction of the Legion of Doom in the early '80s. But coming to the WWF, he finally came as Jake the Snake Roberts because everybody had some sort of gimmick, so they needed one too. Another guy, the guy that he's wrestling on the card at WrestleMania 2, George Wells, is another guy that was in Mid-South because Bill Watts, after JYD leaves, Bill Watts had such success with with JYD as a black babyface. That became his formula. But JYD left to go to the WWF, so he needs another black babyface, and he tries to, as hard as he can, to recreate that. You know what I mean? He turns Butch Reed babyface, tries to have him as the main babyface / star. That doesn't work, mostly because Butch Reed leaves the company and goes to the WWF too. This guy, the Snowman, also Master G. This is Master G. George Wells, a rapping gimmick coming out to Rapper's Delight, just like uh, uh, our dog came out to Queens, another one bites the dust. Well, this guy George Wells comes out to uh, Rapper's Delight, and Watts is really late because this is the mid '80s, and Rapper's Delight came out in 1979. You know, he came out with a Sanford and Son gimmick in the '70s, and I guess that was timely. I guess that show was still on the air because that was Junkyard Dog's gimmick. Bill Watts listened to a lot of music, I guess, because Jim Croce's song Leroy Brown. That's where he gets the name. Uh, Meaner than a junkyard dog. And in the beginning, when Sylvester Ritter and JYD first came out in Mid South, he would wheel a pail of garbage out to the ring because he was supposed to be a junk dealer like Fred Sanford. But anyway, that's the other match. That's the other match in New York. Those matches. So Orndorff versus Morocco, Randy Savage with Liz versus Steele for the IC title. And then in Chicago, you have the Fabulous Moolah against Velvet McIntyre. And a flag match, Corporal Kirshner, because Sergeant Slaughter is no longer in the company. He has left the company. He left WWE to go to the AWA because he was getting a licensing deal from the creators of G.I. Joe, and Vince wanted a piece of it, and he wasn't willing to give that up. So in the midst of his very hot feud in '84, '85 with the Iron Sheik, he leaves the WWF, so they need a new patriotic person, so they come up with Corporal Kirshner, and he has a flag match on WrestleMania 2 with Nikolai Volkov. And then you have the Battle Royal. Right? Also, you have the British Bulldogs, now managed by Captain Lou Albano, also with British rocker Ozzy Osbourne in their corner, against the Dream Team, Greg Valentine and Brutus Beefcake. Now, since we last did our last video, the Dream Team has formed, and they defeat the U.S. Express defeated Koloff and the Iron Sheik, and then Johnny Valiant's team of Greg Valentine and Brutus Beefcake defeat the U.S. Express, mostly because Wyndham and Rotunda are now both going to the NWA. Wyndham will do great in the NWA, and Rotunda will do decently before coming up with the Michael Wall Street gimmick, later on. Rotunda goes to join the Varsity Club with Kevin Sullivan and Rick Steiner, while Wyndham goes to first team with Lex Luger and then turn on Luger in '88 and become Luger's replacement in the Four Horsemen. But they left the WWF, so they surrender the belts to the Dream Team, Valentine and Beefcake, and Valentine and Beefcake have the match with the British Bulldogs at WrestleMania. That's the Rosemont Horizon. Now, for the Los Angeles Sports Arena, Ricky Steamboat is taking on Hercules Hernandez. Adrian Adonis with Jimmy Hart is taking on Uncle Elmer. Terry Funk and Hoss Funk, his brother, Dory, are taking on Tito Santana and the Junkyard Dog, and Hulk Hogan is taking on King Kong Bundy. Now, the official rundown, let me tell you guys who won what. The Paul Orndorff Magnificent Morocco match ended in a double countout. An interesting one in this is that Paul Orndorff basically does this to Morocco. And it's an interesting brawl, but I never really liked Orndorff as a face. I guess because when I got into professional wrestling, he was a heel in WCW, and that was how I saw him. You know what I mean? Randy Savage defeats George the Animal Steel. Jake Roberts makes quick work of George Wells. Mr. T with Joe Frazier, and Roddy Piper with Lou Duva. It was a disqualification because this match got to a certain point, guys, that it really sucked. It was really putting the crowd in Nassau Coliseum to sleep. So Piper just hit Mr. T with a stool, and it was done with. Haiti Kid was also in the corner of Mr. T and Joe Frazier. Because remember, on an episode of Piper's Pits, Orton and Piper shaved Haiti Kid's head. So he's out there to get revenge. Fabulous Moolah defeats Velvet McIntyre. Corporal Kushner defeats Nikolai Volkov. And the Fabulous Moolah match sucked. The Corporal Kushner match was a sleeper. And what I want to mention is the Battle Royal. Now, another person that came to the WWE in 1985 from his father's promotion was Bret the Hitman Hart, much like the British Bulldogs. Vince McMahon was going all around to all the other territories, asking them if they'll take the deal. If they didn't, he would run in competition against them and he would defeat them and put them out of business. Jim Crockett didn't. Vern Gagne didn't. Bill Watts didn't. Mike and Gene LaBelle, like I said, they did because LA was on its last legs in '82. But another promotion that was on its last legs also was Stampede Wrestling, Stu Hart's territory in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. But under one condition, Stu Hart said that he would accept the buyout. He would only accept the buyout if Vince McMahon agreed to take the Dynamite Kid, Tom Billington, the British Bulldog, his cousin, the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith, Bret Hart, his son, and Jim Neidhart. Two of them that are will become his future son-in-laws. One was married to his daughter Illy, which is Natty Neidhart's mom, and the other is married to Stu's daughter Diana. They would all go to the WWF. and that was the best deal that Vince could have made because these guys, the Hart, what will become the Hart Foundation, Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart, managed by Jimmy Hart, and the British Bulldogs were having killer matches, man, killer matches. And what a year it was for Tom Billington, because um before he really blew up with the British Bulldogs in the WWF, he was going over to Japan having uh, killer matches with Satoru Sayama, the original Tiger Mask, which became legend in the wrestling community. Those matches between the Dynamite Kid and Satoru Sayama. So Bret Hart comes to the WWF, and he's a tag team wrestler. Like I said, member of the Hart Foundation. But originally, Vince wants him to be a cowboy. He figures, hey, he's from Western Canada. He knows about cowboy culture. Bret Hart refused. Bret Hart said, that's the point, Vince. I'm from Western Canada. I grew up with real cowboys, but I'm not a cowboy. So I'm not going to be cowboy Bret Hart. So he takes a page out of Thomas Hearn's book, uh, the boxer who just had one of the year before in 1985, he had one of the most knockdown drag-out matches in the history of boxing with Marvin Hagler, which they aptly termed a war. The Marvin Hagler uh, Thomas Hearns match. If you never saw that, guys, and you're a fan of boxing, look that up. That match is brutal. But anyway, so Thomas Hitman Hearns is well known. So Bret Hart asks him, and he says, "Yeah, you could take my name." So Bret Hart becomes Bret the Hitman Hart, and they just won. I mean, they would go on later that year to win the tag team championships from the British Bulldogs after the British Bulldogs beat Beefcake and Valentine, because Beefcake and Valentine defeat the U.S. Express, and they're going into WrestleMania 2 as tag team champions. um, so he becomes the second guy to survive this battle royal. Andre the Giant wins the battle royal, but Bret Hart goes the distance, and that really proves something to Vince. And eventually, Bret the Hitman Hart has the star power to go on his own. Now, it would take several years. He would continue to compete as a tag team wrestler until 1991, but it really put the people on notice that Bret Hart is something special, and he's the last to be eliminated by Andre the Giant. Oddly enough, all the last two were WWF guys and not NFL guys. You know, it was Andre in the yellow. Andre didn't have the black singlet yet. He didn't have the black singlet until he turned heel, which is an important distinction I make. And we'll talk a lot about his heel turn when we talk about, when we talk about WrestleMania 3, which his heel turn is a huge part of it. And I'll give my opinion, what I believe about uh, when wrestlers, longtime baby faces, because Andre was a longtime baby face, when longtime baby faces like Cena right now turn heel, it's important that they change their look. Like, we haven't seen Cena yet come out, because he didn't come out on Raw last week. You know what I mean? After Elimination Chamber. But when we do see Cena again, he needs to change his look. You know what I mean? The jorts and the bright and colorful Fruity Pebbles t-shirts, that's not going to work for a heel Cena. Just like with Andre, he wouldn't use the singlet. At WrestleMania 1, he used the regular blue tights. Here he has the yellow tights. And when he became a heel, he used the singlet, mostly because he had a back surgery, and the singlet allowed him to wear his brace without people seeing it, right? Which we'll talk about that when we talk about the build and hype to WrestleMania 3. But also because, he's a heel and he wanted a new look. But here he has the yellow tights and he wins because he was an expert at battle royals. Andre always won the battle royals. Every time they would have competitions throughout all the other U.S. territories, he would go in mostly for the battle royals. He wins. But Bret Hart has a good showing as well. And Bruno Sammartino is in the Battle Royal. Like I said, they kept, Bruno Sammartino, and this is not a knock on the Italians, because Roddy Piper had a thing with Bruno where he was saying racist shit about Italians. Because again, Roddy Piper's character in 1985-86 was the character of a racist. You know what I mean? Like if he was competing against Rocky Johnson and Tony Atlas, he was saying shit against the black people. If he was competing against Bruno, he was calling him a wop and saying shit about Italians. If he was competing against a Puerto Rican or a Hispanic wrestler like Pedro Morales or Tito Santana, he was saying shit about Mexicans or Puerto Ricans. You know what I mean? Like his character was that he was racist. So he calls Bruno a wop, and then Bruno punches him out. And they keep trying to drag Bruno in. As you recall, last time at WrestleMania 1, he was in his son's corner. This time the son's not around anymore because David Sammartino had some issues with steroids where he was having a match with against the Macho Man Randy Savage, and he actually punched a fan. Right? So they let him go after this. But they want the father to still come in. You know what I mean? And it's weird that they have the father in Chicago. Now, Bruno was never popular in Chicago. They should have did the thing with something with him in New York. But they dragged Bruno back in. Later, he would get dragged into a feud with the Macho Man. After the Macho Man injures Ricky Steamboat's throat, which we'll talk about because it's part of the build. We'll talk about in the next video because it's part of the build to WrestleMania 3. Bruno is the color commentator for there, and he goes to interview the Macho Man, and the Macho Man says, that he's proud of what he did to Ricky Steamboat, and Bruno drops the mic and goes, "And you're proud of it, you son!" And he chokes Savage, and him and Savage have a match. So again, they keep trying to drag Bruno in, but like 87 is the last year, the cutoff year, but he's here this time. Bill Fralick actually had a crazy confrontation with Andre the Giant. On this pay-per-view, he has a confrontation with Big John Studd, right? Because Mean Gene does an interview with him, and then Big John Studd goes up to confront him. But in real life, he had a confrontation with Andre the Giant because he was talking shit about wrestling, saying it's fake and everything. He could take all the wrestlers if he wanted to. And Andre goes, "You talk too much." And Andre was ready to fuck him up. A lot was happening backstage this year because this was the same year that Jesse Ventura tried to unionize the wrestlers. This was WrestleMania 2. He figured, hey, we have a lot of leverage in our back pocket against Vince. Let's unionize. And of course, as we know from the Netflix special, Hulk Hogan snitches him out to Vince, and that puts him on the outs with WWE. And he almost leaves WWE when he goes to film The Predator. But Dick Ebersol likes him so much that he won't accept any other announcer to work his position for Saturday Night's Main Event other than Jesse. So they're kind of forced to bring Jesse back as long as they're working with NBC. So a lot is going on backstage. So that's the main event for Chicago. That's the main event for Chicago. For LA, the Ricky Steamboat Hercules Hernandez match is pretty good. Hercules Hernandez is coming from Mid-South Wrestling. He was managed in Mid-South by Jim Cornette. And he left that promotion to go to the WWE. A lot of people are leaving various promotions because, again, what Vince would do, Vince was like the George Steinbrenner of wrestling. He would gobble up everybody's top talent, and he would create a super team of wrestlers. So if you were on top in Mid-South as a heel or a babyface, he would take you. If you were on top in Crockett, he would take you. If you were on top In Don Owens' territory, he would take you, but he took several wrestlers from Don Owens' territory, including a wrestler that we'll talk about in the WrestleMania 3 installment, Billy Jack Haynes, who wrestles Hercules Hernandez in uh, at WrestleMania 3. He took Piper also, he took from the Carolinas, but Piper spent a lot of time in Don Owens' territory in Portland. An interesting thing with Piper is when the WWF would run shows in Portland, he would not appear because he didn't want to promote directly against Don Owens because he respected Don Owens so much. Until Pacific North Wrestling went out of business, in the late '80s and early '90s. That's what Vince would do. That's what he did in Minneapolis. The first show he ran in Minneapolis, he ran with Hogan and Dave Schultz and Mean Gene Okerlund and Bobby Heenan when he got them back in '84. So then he got Hercules Hernandez from Mid South, and this is a pretty good match because again, Ricky Steamboat can carry pretty much anybody to a good match. Ricky Steamboat later in the year would develop an interesting feud with Jake the Snake Roberts because Ricky Steamboat would bring out a kimono dragon and Jake the Snake Roberts would bring out the snake. And Ricky Steamboat became the first ever victim of the DDT on the outside the outside floor. A DDT right there on concrete floor. But this match is pretty good. This is the first match of the LA series. Like I said, uh, the Funk Brothers defeat the JYD. Yeah, um, interesting. Terry Funk. I said in the Terry Funk video that Terry Funk's that they called him Jimmy Jack Funk. That wasn't him. That was Jesse Barr. They brought him in as a Funk brother. It was interesting that because of this match and because of they had to work around the loop of the JYD, and Terry Funk felt that JYD was a horrible worker and he didn't like working with him. So because of that, he left WWF. And they never really brought him back until 1998. Even then, he was Chainsaw Charlie in '98. They really didn't, I guess, like Terry Funk. And it's interesting that they chose to cover up Dory's name because Dory was an ex-NWA champion. But I guess the revisionist history of Vince McMahon, he must have tried to change wrestling history and remake it in his own image. So he downplayed Dory and Terry and their history as the only two brothers to ever both win the NWA championship. Interesting. But they defeat Santana and JYD. And then finally the main event. The main event was kind of boring. Hogan got a little juice. The commentary in LA was pretty good. It was Jesse the Body Ventura and Elvira. Each city had a different commentary team. New York had Vince McMahon and Susan St. James, Dick Ebersol's wife. Chicago had Mean Gene Okerlund and Gorilla Monsoon with Kathy Lee Crosby, the tennis player. And LA had Elvira and Jesse the Body Ventura, and Elvira looked hot. But Elvira wasn't the best out of them all. Susan St. James was annoying. You know what I mean? Like, she didn't know shit. She kept trying to say that her grandfather was a wrestling fan, which was a lie. You know what I mean? Oh, my grandfather was a wrestling fan. Bitch, you only there because you were married to Dick Ebersol. Who are you trying to kid? They began the tradition this year of singing America the Beautiful. Interestingly, Vince McMahon never liked to sing the national anthem. He did the first year. Yeah, Mean Gene sing the national anthem, WrestleMania 1, but he preferred America the Beautiful. And it was a beautiful rendition of America the Beautiful. by Ray Charles. One of uh, one of the best. This one had a lot of celebrities too. This one had G. Gordon Liddy, Cab Calloway, the Wendy's lady. Where's the beef commercial? Elvira, Susan St. James, Ozzy Osbourne, Joan Rivers, just Ricky Schroeder from Silver Spoons was there. A lot of celebrities WrestleMania too. But overall, I didn't feel like it was a good show. The best matches on the show, in my opinion, were um, Brutus Beefcake and Greg the Hammer Valentine versus the British Bulldogs. That was like to me the Steeler, and Ricky Steamboat versus Hercules Hernandez was another good match. Other than that, these matches were really lackluster. It wasn't a financial downgrade from WrestleMania one, but it was a content downgrade. You know, it, it it had too many celebrities. Like it was an overkill of celebrities. The football players, Cab Calloway, Joan Rivers, G. Gordon Liddy, who was a conservative talk show host. I mean, it was a who's who, but at the same time, it was just too much. They toned it down the following year with the celebrities. They'll have a couple. They'll have Mary Hart. They'll have Bob Uecker, and we'll talk about it when we get to it. But this year, WrestleMania 2, 86, just too many celebrities, man. Like there was a celebrity around every corner, and that to me is never good because you want to use the celebrities to build your brand in the way that Mr. T enhanced Hulk Hogan, not to have the celebrities overshadow the wrestler. And in many cases, I felt like in the NFL WWE Battle Royal, they overshadowed the wrestler kind of, even though the wrestler won the match. Also, I felt they overshadowed them in the boxing match. And the boxing match is one of the worst things, one of the worst abortions ever. You know what I mean? Thank God, you know, later in the year. And the Adrian Adonis Uncle Elmer match was a match I didn't mention. And that also, that one there took place in LA. That was horrible too. Uncle Elmer was, AKA Plyboy Frazier. He was terrible. I mean, he was atrocious. Um, Adrian Adonis, the adorable one, Adrian Adonis, he could really move around for a big guy his size. And he was taking hellacious bumps. And we'll see at WrestleMania 3 in his match against Piper. This is what I was about to say, that later on in 86, because of his 86, 87, in a confrontation with Adrian Adonis on the flower shop, Piper does turn face. And, you know, and goes into semi-retirement. We'll talk about it when we get to WrestleMania 3. It's an interesting angle that I always loved as a kid. But Piper at WrestleMania 2, most of this is a dud. This is a B-grade WrestleMania. This was their second attempt. Next year, though, they're going bigger than bigger. And now the next one we're going to talk about is probably, if you compare WrestleManias to Star Wars movies, let's just say uh, the event we're going to talk about next year, 1987, WrestleMania 3 is the Empire Strikes Back of wrestling events. It is universally agreed upon as the culmination of the Hogan era. Hogan at this point has a cartoon. Hulk Hogan's Rockin' and Wrestling. He's voiced by Brad Garrett. He's really on top of the world. And he has right now the Hogan 86 belt. For those that are belt collectors, a very rare version of the early WWF Championship. But overall, I give this a C minus. Forget about I said a B plus, a C minus. There's only like one or two good matches on this show. So if you're gonna watch all the WrestleManias in succession, watch them. But overall, this one is one you could really skip. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next video is coming out. Love you guys. And the next video will be WrestleMania 3, by the way. Hogan and Andre, 93,000 plus, or is it? We'll talk about the lore surrounding it. We'll talk about the build-up to it. We'll talk about the celebrity involvement, which is significant celebrity involvement in several matches, particularly Jake Roberts' match, and also uh, Harley Race's match against the Junkyard Dog. There's celebrity involvement in some way connected to the Fabulous Moolah. We'll talk about it though. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And what happens in 1987 with regards to the Iron Sheik, and another guy that comes over from Mid South in '87, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. It's all going to be covered in the WrestleMania 3 episode. But overall, the WrestleMania 2 episode, this is and King Kong Bundy, this is the early example of the Miz, what I call the Miz phenomenon. When we get to WrestleMania 27 in the next coming weeks, we will be talking about the Miz, who wrestles John Cena at WrestleMania 27 in 2011. And what happens to Miz, he's wrestling Cena, and then the next year he's wrestling in a Raw versus SmackDown match with Johnny Ace on one hand and Teddy Long on the other. Like, it's terrible. He falls from grace immediately. But that happened to King Kong Bundy first. King Kong Bundy, here he is in the main event working with Hogan. And then the next year he's wrestling midgets. We'll talk about it, WrestleMania 3. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And they'll be in George the Animal Steel's hometown in Michigan, Pontiac, Michigan. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.